Session hijacking. In this lesson, we're going to talk about session hijacking, explaining what this type of attack is, the different attacks, variety of attacks, and the techniques. So let's go ahead and get started in learning about this devastating type of attack. Now, before we start talking about the techniques and attack methods, let's first understand what a session hijacking is. To understand the concept of session hijacking, consider an authenticated TCP session between two hosts. It can be a user and a server. Now, an attacker, which is a third person, intercepts the session and takes it over. When the session's authentication process is complete, the user becomes authorized to use resources such as web services, TCP communications, or whatever the intended target was. So, again, this third person now has access to all that private, sensitive information. So, that's what a session hijacking is. It can be severe depending on the sensitivity of the data revealed and the significance of the application being accessed. It can result in financial fraud, identity theft, data, you name it. Now, there's many different type of session hijacking techniques, and we're going to go over and look at the ones that you will need for the CEH exam. So, stealing. There are various techniques for stealing a session ID, such as a refer attack, network sniffing, Trojans, etc. Also, guessing. Guessing is using tricks and techniques to guess the session ID by observing variable components of a session ID or calculating a valid session ID or trying to figure out the sequence in that session ID. Or sometimes brute forcing is used. It's the process of guessing every possible combination of credentials. Now, the process of a session hijacking involves these. First of all, sniffing. An attacker attempts to place himself between the victim and the target to sniff the packet. And also monitoring. The attacker monitors the traffic flow between the victim and the target. Now, at some point, there's going to be what's called a session desynchronization. And basically, what that means is that session is actually broken between the 2 points. And the attacker takes control of the session by predicting the session ID. And once they predict that session ID and they got that session ID, they do what's called a command injection. And they take control of the section and they start inserting commands. Now, let's look at different types of session hijacking. To start off with, we have an active and a passive. Now, the active attack involves the attacker actively intersecting the active session. They may send packets to the host, getting information and manipulating components or whatever. And as far as a passive attack, the hijacker actually is just monitoring the communication between the hosts without sending any packets. Now, different types of attacks happen at different types of the OSI model. At application level hijacking, it involves hijacking the application layer, such as HTTP sessions. In this type of hijacking process, the attacker is looking for legitimate session IDs from a victim to gain access to an authenticated session that allows the attacker to use web resources or applications that use web resources. Now, the attacker may do this by compromising session IDs using sniffing. Session sniffing is a technique in which an attacker looks for a session ID or token by sniffing. We mentioned that previously on slides before. Once they find that session ID, they can gain access to the resources that they were targeting. They could also get session IDs by predicting the session token or session ID. Basically, again, they're guessing what the next session ID is going to be. And how do they predict that session token? Web servers normally use random session ID generating tools to prevent prediction. However, some web servers use custom defined algorithms to assign a session ID. The diagram below shows some examples. And what the attacker would do is try to guess the next sequence of what the session ID would be. Now, compromising session IDs using a man in the middle attack. This requires splitting the connection between the victim and the server into two connections, one between the victim and an attacker, and another between the attacker and the server. Also, there is compromising session IDs using a man in the browser attack. So basically, this requires a Trojan of some sort to be deployed to that target machine. The Trojan can change the proxy settings or redirect all traffic through the attacker. Another Trojan technique is intercepting the process between the browser and its security mechanism. Now, these are the steps of performing a man in the browser attack. The attacker first infects the victim's machine using a Trojan to launch a man in the browser attack. The Trojan installs malicious code on the victim's machine in the form of an extension that modifies the browser's configuration upon boot. Now, when the user logs to a site, the URL is checked against a known list of targeted websites. The event handler registers the event upon detection, and using a DOM interface, the attacker can extract and modify the values when the user clicks the button. The browser will send the form with modified entries to the web server. Now, the user cannot identify any interception as the browser shows the original transaction details. So, also, there is compromising the session IDs using a client side of attack. That's another technique. They can be compromised using cross site scripting, malicious Java script code, or Trojans. When a cross-site script attack happens, the attacker performs a cross-site scripting attack by sending a crafted link with a malicious script, and the user clicks on this link, and the script is executed. Or using a cross-site request forgery attack, basically this happens when the process of obtaining a legitimate user session ID and exploiting the active session with a trusted website to perform malicious activities. Other type of attacks, the session replay attack. This is another technique for session hijacking where attackers capture from the user's authentication token intended for the server and replay it to the requesting server. Then there's also the session fixation. This attack is permitting the attacker to hijack the session. The attacker has to provide a valid session ID and make the victim's browser use it. This is done by the following techniques: the session token and URL argument, the session token in hidden form, or the session ID in a cookie. Also, there is network level hijacking, and these focus on the transport layer and the internet layer of the OSI model. Now, there's different types of hacking techniques at this layer. There's the blind hijacking, UDP hijacking, TCP hijacking, RST hijacking, man in the middle, and IP spoofing. Now, you're at this point probably very familiar with the TCP communication or the three-way handshake. The TCP communication initiates a three-way handshake between the requesting and the target host. The handshake communicates with the send packets and the ACK packets. Again, just a little refresher there. Now, for TCP IP hijacking, the process is this. On a TPC session, in which the attacker predicts the sequence number of packets flowing between the victim and host, to perform this attack, an attacker must be on the same network as the victim. Usually, the attacker has sniffed the traffic to capture the packets and extract the sequence number at that point. By injecting the spoof packet, the attacker can interrupt that session. So that's how a TCP IP hijacking would work. Also, there's a source routing type of technique. This is sending a packet via a selected route. In the session hijacking, this technique is used to attempt to IP spoofing as a legitimate host with the help of source routing to direct traffic through a path identical to the victim's path. Again, a different technique. RST hijacking is the process of sending a reset packet. Again, in that three-way handshake, they're sending a reset packet to the victim with a spoof source address. The acknowledgement number used in this reset packet is also predicted. So when the victim receives this packet, they will not be aware that it's spoofed. The victim or the host on that end resets the connection, assuming that the actual source requested resets the connection. Also, there's the blind hijacking. This is a technique used when the attacker is unable to capture the return traffic. The attacker captures a packet coming from the victim and heading toward the server, inject a malicious packet, and forwards it to the target server. Forged ICMP and ARP spoofing. These are different, another type of attack. This man in the middle attack can be used to carry out using a forged ping packet or ICMP packet and ARP spoofing techniques. These forged packets, such as destination unavailable or high latency messages, are sent to fool the victim. And there's also UDP hijacking. In this type of technique, it's simpler than the TCP session. The UDP, since it's a connectionless protocol, does not require any sequence packet between the requesting client and the host. The UDP session hijacking is all about sending a response packet before the destination server responds. Okay, we learned about what session hijacking is, the different techniques are used, the hijacking process, types of session hijacking, application level hijacking, and network level hijacking. A lot of information in just this first portion. I want to thank you for being with me in this lesson, and we will see you in the next lesson.